There we go. Hi everyone in Facebook land. This is Bumi Menanja. I'm the founder of Atlas Book Club, a book subscription books company focused on globally diverse children's books. And I am so thrilled and so happy to be talking to my friend Jessica Powers today about how to incorporate diverse children's books into your homeschooling curriculum and your virtual learning. So we're going to get into that. But first, I'd like you to meet Jessica. Thank you, Jessica, for being here. I'm so excited to get into this. Jessica is the founder of Catalyst Press, a publishing company dedicated to publishing African writers. And so, Jessica, I'll let you go ahead and tell us more about yourself.
Sure. So hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here with Bumi. I'm a big fan of the work that she does at Atlas Book Club, not least because she's included some of the books that I've published. but I would be thrilled anyway, because I think it's a really important business that she's created. So I grew up on the US-Mexico border, and actually I was homeschooled myself. I don't think that I mentioned that to you, Bumi, but
I know that, no.
But I grew up where my parents still live. It's about 3 to 4 miles from the Mexico border. And it's just in that little corner where New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico meet. And so I kind of grew up in, it's not necessarily a culturally diverse region because it's extremely Mexican and Mexican American, but it was culturally diverse for me because my parents are from the Midwest, and my dad's from South Dakota and my mom's from Iowa, and so the outside home culture, or the outside culture, was very different from the home culture, which, as you know, is becoming more and more popularized, the term third culture kid. So I grew up as a third culture kid, and always have felt very comfortable in cross-cultural situations as a result, because this was just the norm and the everyday, and just not anything extraordinary or out of the ordinary for me growing up. The summer I turned 19, I went and worked with street children in Nairobi, Kenya. And as I tell many people the story, when I told my dad that I was going to Kenya to work with street children, he got this far away nostalgic look in his eyes, and he said, "Did you know you were conceived in northern Kenya on the shores of Lake Turkana?" I was like, "No, Dad, I really didn't know that, and I'm not sure if I needed to know that." But my dad is a geologist, and he worked with the Leakey family on the Early Man project as a graduate student. And my mother went and joined him and took their 2-year-old, and then, conceived me. And so that summer was personally very transformative. And I ended up going on to graduate school in African history. I got a couple of graduate degrees in African history. But I knew that I didn't really want to be an academic, even when I went into graduate school. In fact, my personal statement said something like, I really want to make African history accessible to people, because academic history is not accessible to people. It, uses language that people take years to cultivate through, intense reading of other books that nobody's reading, that uses vocabulary that's a very insider type of vocabulary, and just the way sentences are constructed is just it's not inviting, and it's not inclusive, and it's not welcoming, and it's nothing that anybody would read unless they happen to be a professional historian who have to read it. And frankly, I don't know how many of professional historians really love reading those books either, but they just have to. It's a specific genre. And so, I ended up leaving my PhD program because I realized that it was not conducive to me continuing this goal of making history and just accessible to. I realized the longer I stayed in it, it was kind of narrowing me into this inability to communicate with people outside of the academia, out of the academy. And but I didn't necessarily know I was going to start launch a publishing company to publish African writers, and specifically a whole line of books with my partners at Jive Media on telling African stories, and specifically African history through graphic novels. That came a few years after I quit graduate school.
Yeah. That's how we met. Yeah, we met through actually, let's see, I actually have it here. Shaka Rising was one of the first selections for our, that was the first selection for our SOAR box when we launched in November. That was our December pick. And that's how we met and we connected. And I just especially love Shaka Rising. I mean, when I read, I hadn't seen anything like it, you know, and I just love the fact that it portrayed a side of African history and a side of the slave trade in a way that a lot of people haven't thought about it, and the role that South Africans or the Zulu Kingdom played in that. So I absolutely loved it. I love the fact that it was a graphic novel, which is something that in my experience, kids are drawn to, you know, that's just, and I guess that shows that you accomplished that goal of making African history accessible, because this is very accessible to kids. Like they love, you know, all, you know, graphic novels and novels that fall into that, you know, Dogman, Captain Underpants kind of, you know, books. But this, of course, is more advanced than that. So yeah, that's how we met. So let's talk a little bit about homeschooling. Let's just jump right into it.
All right.
Because, you know, I was thinking about this early on. We have about 30 minutes, and that time flies really, really fast. So we'll jump into it. But actually, before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about global culture. And so you said you've lived in Nairobi, Kenya. I know you've been to South Africa, and I'm sure you have other travels that I'm not aware of. What role does global culture play in how you homeschool your child?
Well, it's really, I think, probably the centerpiece of how I homeschool. And although I haven't sort of officially kind of designated myself as what they call a world schooler, I think that I follow that practice pretty closely. And a world schooler basically sees the world as your playground, so to speak, or your school, you know. And so world schools place a key emphasis on traveling, seeing things, visiting museums, visiting historic sites, visiting, you know, engaging with, you know, local cultures, and with your own home culture too. Like it doesn't even have to be locations that are far flung, because not everybody can afford to do that or have the ability to do that in terms of their jobs. But I, you know, realized early on, you know, that I really love hanging out with my kid.
Yeah.
I didn't, you know, it was a physical ache to think about putting him in a schoolhouse when I was looking at the local schools and how they had, it was a 5.5-hour kindergarten program, and they had 15 minutes a day set aside for recess. And I was like, he's 5 years old. He is not prepared to sit for, you know, 5 hours and 15 minutes a day at a desk.
How old is he now?
He is almost 10. He'll be 10 at the end of this month. Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, he, based on his birth date, he actually would have been closer to 6 when he started kindergarten. But nevertheless, it just seemed wrong to me somehow to make any child, but particularly a little boy who's got a lot of energy, and to do that, and you know, I don't think that there's many kindergarten teachers out there that feel very good about it either. From everything that I've read, you know, they just recognize, you know, kids need to be getting into stuff. They need to be painting. They need to be playing with Play-Doh. They need to be running around, and that play is in fact the way children learn so much. And so it was just such a physical ache to me. And I was starting to travel a lot more, both as a writer and considering my, you know, publishing company, which He was 6 when I launched it, but
Mhm.
you know, prior to that, I was returning to South Africa on
Mhm.
multiple occasions, and like when he was 2, we went for 4 weeks, and when he was 5, we went for 8 weeks, and then when he was 7, we went for 3 weeks, and then 8, another 6 weeks. So, you know, I've just sort of continuously brought him back to South Africa, but also I've taken him to Great Britain and the UK and all over the United States. And I've just always made it this central point, like, okay, I'm taking my kid along. I have
Yeah,
to figure
yeah,
out, you know, I have to figure out because he's not in school. So I have to take him
yeah,
along.
yeah.
And, you know, I'll have to figure out while I'm there, like, okay, friends or my mom would come along and watch him at times when I couldn't have him with me when I needed to be working, but then they would take him out to local museums or
Mhm.
experience things.
Mhm.
And so I just always just kind of brought him along and made that a centerpiece of his education, to the point where I, you know, so much of what we do isn't formalized education. It's just
I.
you know, well, we're here. We're, you know, like right now we're in Northern California. The fires are going everywhere. There's smoke.
Mhm.
So, you know, I mean, he's just experiencing living in a, you know, fire zone. It's just part of it.
Yeah. And parents homeschool for a multiple of reasons. You have the choice to homeschool. You also have the choice to go through a traditional, school program. But I guess the advantage to some extent of homeschooling is the ability to have your child experience, have a different type of educational experience. And, like you said, when you travel, you take him with you, and there's, almost no substitute for that actual experience of going to the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, for example, and walking through the halls and soaking all that in, but while there is no substitute for that real life experience, we can get that through books. I mean, that's the closest thing to it. And
Absolutely.
even more so than movies or documentary, because with the books, you can actually get into it, have your imagination take over, and fully experience what the author is trying to convey. So let's talk a little. You and I have talked about this before, and we actually did an interview together. It's getting kind of dark here, so I'm having all these shadows. But anyway, um, what would you say is the role of global diversity, the representation of global diversity in children's books? What would you say about the importance of that and how that factors into how you homeschool your child?
Yeah, well, I think that it's really important. You know, I mean, we do have a diverse country, of course. And it's important for kids to be reading diverse literature that are written by Americans from different cultures, but those are still shaped within the American experience, and they still have, you know, cultural touchstones that are in common in so many ways. You may have a different experience of living under the Constitution if you're, you know, Mexican American or African American than if you're a white American, but you still have the Constitution as a cultural touchstone. And so all of these books that represent, you know, diverse groups within the United States that are written by Americans from different groups still have so much in common, so
Mhm.
much reference points that are similar. And so the conversation is still about many of the same things. They're in conversation with each other. And I think that that's really important. But when you start to look at books that are written by people thoroughly outside of that conversation, and those aren't their cultural touchstones, those aren't their reference points, they're not concerned about the American Constitution or New York City isn't there, you know, a major cultural center.
Mhm.
It's just a really different experience, and we tend to be very myopic in the United States.
Mhm. Mhm.
We know virtually nothing about what's going on in other countries unless it directly impacts us. And this is a huge problem for us as we move into the future. China is becoming a major colonizing force around the world. It's buying up huge properties and businesses all over the world, including in our backyard and and it owns a lot of our debt. So here, and we have we need to be more aware of that kind of thing, but we're not talking about it in the United States, and our kids aren't growing up aware of it, and yet it's going to directly impact their future. I think all of these things, we need to start inviting these other things into the conversation and into our understanding of the world and into our understanding of how we're going to live in the world and how we're going to operate. And our kids are not going to be prepared to be global citizens, which they will have to be global citizens. The United States is not going to be able to remain this isolated thing. It's already imploding because of it, and we're just not preparing our kids very well if we don't prepare them to be global citizens. And the only way we can do that is if we begin to invite them to participate in conversations that are happening outside of the United States. And that's through books. And there's other things too, and I'll touch on some other ways that people can do it, but those books are key and important.
Yeah. And no, I absolutely agree. I've been saying that, our kids are going to enter in 10, 15, 20 years from now, they're going to enter into a workforce that's going to be more globally diverse than ever. So we need to start preparing them now. I think, global literature should be just as important as science and math. We need to arm them with those tools to be able to work and communicate with people from all backgrounds, from different backgrounds, and I strongly feel we do them a disservice when we're not doing that. And I think the other thing with, being in the United States is that we're geographically far from other countries. So for example, I think people in the United Kingdom, for example, or in other parts of Europe, they have a more global experience, because say if you're in England, you can hop on a plane and an hour or two later you're in Italy or you're in Spain or you're in a totally different culture, whereas we have just geographically further to travel to experience more of a global culture. So I think that makes it even more important for us to intentionally expose our children to global diversity. I mean, it's just super important. So let's talk specifically about how we do that in the homeschooling setting, and not just homeschooling setting, in the virtual learning setting. So as you said, we have homeschoolers, and people like you who have tried, been doing this long before homeschooling was even a term to people like me. You all have been doing it. And, as you mentioned earlier when we were talking, that's a totally different experience from what people like me are doing now. What we're doing is virtual learning, essentially. We're, having, still going to a traditional school, but doing it in a more virtual, remote manner. So that being said, how can a parent, I think let's put it into two separate discussions. How can a homeschooling parent like you introduce, if they're not already doing it, introduce globally diverse children's books into their curriculum, especially if they're a family or a homeschooling family, a parent that travels a lot, but now that's even more limited now because of the pandemic and travel has been restricted. How can they do that? And then on the other hand, how can parents like me who are engaged in this virtual learning, and I've been saying parents like me now, we have more control over what our kids are exposed to. We have more control over the books that they select for their book report, etc. So how, if you have any tips for those two types of parents, and then we'll get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I would say that I probably wouldn't distinguish between the two, because whatever homeschooling parents can do, parents who, you know, the only workaround is for parents whose kids are in, you know, regular school, doing school at home, but the virtual learning, you know, they just have to sort of either filter it into that by, as you pointed out, having a little more control over the books that they choose for things like book reports, or it's just something that they do additionally as part of, you know, as I said to you, every parent is a teacher. You maybe think you aren't, but in fact you are. I mean, you potty trained your kid, you read books to your kids as a, you know, you did Play-Doh and painting, or you taught them how to ride a bike. Every parent is a teacher. So don't think of yourself as not a teacher. You are. And just embrace that as part of your role. You don't even have to think, oh, I'm a teacher. It's just part of what you do. And so I think it's the same thing. And really, we just have to make these books accessible and available. And there's some really good resources out there. The Global Literature in Libraries Initiative is a really great resource for that. It's www.glli-us.org is the website. And they started a translation prize for children's and young adult literature a couple of years ago. So there's some really good lists there of books that have been translated from languages all around the world, from Bangladesh to you know, Europe to Africa. So it's you know, very globally diverse. It's not just European languages. But I would also say, you know, I think so that's a really good resource. And then there's some really great publishers out there that I would recommend. I mean, there's Cinco Puntos Press, who I work for. A lot of, you know, they do have a very strong focus on the US-Mexico border. There's Groundwood Books in Canada. There's Enchanted Lion. And I think that start thinking outside of the box for these books. So don't necessarily think, oh, you know, my kid is 12, a picture book won't appeal to him. There's actually some extraordinarily sophisticated picture books out there. And so many of the ones that have been translated are so sophisticated in terms of their concepts. They're absolutely, that was my kid. He's almost 10. He just said, I like picture books. I should probably have him come over and tell you about some of his favorite ones, but there's some really sophisticated concepts being conveyed in picture books, mathematical, geographical, social, cultural, etc. So just don't like, and then the you know, graphic novels. A lot of parents somehow think that graphic novels are not as, you don't engage with children at the same level as a text-only novel, but that's absolutely not true. And I will say almost any text, you know, don't be afraid of, you know, don't be afraid of books that maybe even contain some content that you don't agree with, or it's all a room for conversation. So for example, you know, let's look at Asterix and Obelix, which are, you know, these comic books produced in France. These are books about a small band of Gauls who are resisting the Roman Empire. They're resisting colonialism and imperialism. They are actively engaged in warfare, in guerrilla style warfare against the forces of the Roman Empire. You know, we're talking about set 2,000 years ago. And so it's, you know, you might think, oh, it's a European book. It's going to promote colonialism. No, it's the opposite of that. And you can actually talk about that. At the same time, there are stereotyped racist images of Africans in these books. Those need to be addressed and talked about. We don't necessarily need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can discuss all of it. And so you might be really surprised at the things that you might already have on your shelves that are an opportunity for conversations about all of these issues that are, you know, global wide, and get you into something where your kid is already reading it, and you didn't even think about it as an opportunity to introduce your kid to global culture, but there it is.
When you said picture books, I was smiling so hard, my cheeks were hurting. I love picture books. They're one of my favorites. And, you know, like you said, not all of them are just simplistic. I mean, just off the top of my head, there is one, Cinderella of the Nile by Tiny Owl Publishing. I don't know if you've seen that. It is fantastic. And it's not one that if I were choosing it for a box, I wouldn't choose it for like the younger kids. I would actually choose it for like a 9 or 10 or above. I mean, there are some picture books out there, and especially when here's why picture books are easily
I want
some
to
of my
say
favorites.
something about that book because it's an example of how connected we are globally. But go ahead and finish
What,
your
Cinderella?
thought.
Which one? Cinderella of the Nile? Have you read it?
Yes, my friend
Oh,
wrote
I
it.
love it.
A friend of mine wrote it, and
Yeah.
let me tell you something. It was Beverly Naidoo. Now, Beverly Naidoo is South African.
She is.
She married an Indian South African.
Yeah.
Okay. They ended up having to flee apartheid because they were, anti-apartheid resistors.
Yeah.
Her husband spent time in prison. She spent time, and he had to escape through the desert. They've lived in the UK for years. The publisher is Persian, Iranian.
She is,
right?
Yeah.
And so you have all of these. I just want to point out that like that, and yet it's set in Egypt. You have all of these interconnections just in that book alone that connects Europe, the Middle East, and the continent of Africa. The whole continent of Africa, Cairo to Cape Town,
No, I love it. And that's what I love about picture books too, in addition to that, because with a picture book, what you get most of the time is a marriage between an author and an illustrator. And usually, especially if it's a book set in a different part of the world, the illustrator brings their culture, and their heritage to the illustrations. And just so for kids to have an opportunity without going to a museum to see Persian art right there in the picture book, Egyptian art, I just absolutely love it. I love it. And so definitely, I say it all the time, picture books are for everyone. They're not just for, kids and just learning to read or younger kids. So, and the other thing I wanted to touch on, now I lost my train of thought. What did I want to say? Graphic novel. Graphic novels, again, same thing. There's I should be careful about the book titles and spitting out here because a lot of them are like future Atlas selections. I was about to say one, and as you know, we keep that a surprise. So I'm like, don't say it. But I'll say this. There's a graphic novel that we have selected for several months from now, not this month. And it's absolutely fantastic, set in Africa. So no, you're absolutely right. Using those books has a jumping off point for different types of conversations is fantastic. So we're talking about tips, and I want to make sure that everyone gets what they need out of this. First of all, we're going to put the link that you mentioned. I'll get that from you and we'll add it on here. But we said picture books are great. Definitely tap into picture books. We'll provide that link. Graphic novels. Yeah. And you said something else. I can't remember.
Well, I mentioned the Global Literature and Libraries Initiative organization, but I will also say two more takeaways. Enroll in some sort of box subscription. Atlas is obviously a great one. And I'm going to mention probably a competitor, but I also like Kiwi Crates because they have these crafts that are, inspired by cultures around the world. And so that kind of, they don't include the books. They're very different from you in a lot of ways. So people could definitely do both. I love the kind of crafts that they combine to teach children about other cultures. And then third, just, you can travel virtually and you can travel locally and still take all of these principles about, there are so many, let's just look at Louisiana as an example. If you lived in Louisiana, there's all of these microcultures throughout Louisiana that you could just experience on the weekend by just moving from one parish to another, right? In Louisiana, they call them parishes rather than, counties or towns or whatever. That alone is always, mind-boggling to me that we have a state in the United States that uses the word parish. So, keep maps around, keep a globe. When things come up, say, let's go look that up on the map, just make it a priority. Begin to show your kids both how large the world is, but also how small.
Yeah. So I don't know how homeschooling works and if it works this way, if, there are certain subjects, so for example, you have social studies, geography, history, language arts. How can a parent, if you do that as part of your homeschooling experience, incorporate books set in different parts of the world into those different subject matters?
So I definitely think you can do it in pretty much any subject, actually, because so history is an obvious thing. There's so many books out there that explore elements of history in different parts of the world, and that would be social studies too. But science is understood differently in different parts of the world, and to find books that think about science or math, just to understand things like algebra, I believe it was algebra emerging from Islam, and like there are ways you can explore these things in just about every subject. And science is really interesting to look at that way, because we tend to have this absolute faith in and belief in Western style science, but there are empirical studies done around the world for ages in other cultures that just have emerged in different ways. Science is a culture, and Western science has a distinct culture that's closed off to some of these other things, and you can understand other cultures. You don't even always have to necessarily agree with some of the fundamental principles that they end up concluding with or believing in, but you can explore how do they understand medicine, how do they understand this, and how is that connected to and in conversation with our own understanding of Western science. What can we take away from it? You can do this with every subject.
Yeah,
no, you just have to be creative and think outside the box.
No, I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree. And and I'll give some tips of what we do. So for example, starting in 6th grade, my son has to do a book report. I think a minimum of 1 a quarter, but for extra credit, if you just 2, 2 is the extra credit, and African parenting, you're doing the 2. So sometimes I let him pick his own book, but a lot of times I suggest a book that I think he'll enjoy. Now he's starting to trust me more. He's 13, so teenager. He's starting to trust me more when I say, hey, I think you're really going to enjoy this. I'm not going to give you a book that's going to be a bore. He listens to me most of the time now. And, he Shaka Rising, he's read Shaka Rising, which I absolutely love. I mentioned it earlier, it's a historical fiction. No, it's not historical fiction. It's historical, period. It's not fiction. And so he's done that. I think he's read off the top of the Trevor Noah book, Born a Crime. He's read that. He did that for a book report. And I'm trying to think off the top of my head the ones he's done. Gone Adrift. He just read that. So he hasn't done a book report on that yet. But that's a great opportunity for not only for your child to learn more about a different culture, a different country, but then also bring that to the class. Bring that to the class, and that, especially if it's a teacher that's, interested in showcasing, that kind of subject matter. If a report is really good and has some interesting information, I've had the teacher say, hey, you want to, talk about this to the class? And it gives other kids an opportunity to learn from your child. It boosts your child's confidence, because now, they know something that they can share with the class. So we do that a lot for language arts and for book reports. And then for social studies as well. For example, was it last year in 5th grade, they learned about the Mali Empire, Mansa Musa. So when I saw this, started learning about that, I was like, oh my God, I have a Mansa Musa book. And of course he rolled his eyes like, oh, here we go. But he read it. And I, sometimes, not even sometimes, a lot of times it's important for the kids to read a different perspective of that story from what's been offered in their classroom, because there are a million reasons why, the story is not necessarily the most accurate, or it's just one person's view, not even, saying that that author's view is wrong, but that's just one person's view of that history. So it's important for them to read different versions of the same story. So his eyes were totally enlightened when he read that Mansa Musa book and he learned all about the Malian Empire, so that's just one example. There's, when they started talking about slave trade, we read another book, which is a future Atlas book, so I'm not going to say what it is, set in Ghana, where they learned, about where he learned, the book talks about, the slave trade and the beginnings of the slave trade from the perspective of a young boy. You might know this book, just me talking about it, from the perspective of a 10-year-old boy, so, those you should think about social studies as a jumping off point, for you to go, oh, I wonder if there's a book about that. Let's go research, let's Google or whatever, and figure out if there's a book and learn more about that subject matter. Because quite frankly, the teachers, are wonderful as they are, they cannot get into as much depth about some of the subject matters as those subject matters deserve. Sometimes there are certain topics that deserve deeper conversations, deeper learning than any teacher can offer in a school setting, just because of limited time and, just the way classrooms are set up. There's just not that opportunity for that deep learning and discussion. So,
and I also think, just to tack on to that too, is don't underestimate, just like I said, don't think of picture books as for little kids. Don't underestimate your children's ability to engage with adult books too. So for example, my kid was 9 when I handed him Abina and the Important Men, which is published by Oxford University Press. It's a graphic novel. It's taught in university and graduate school classes. It's very dense. And of course, I'm sure there were a gazillion themes in there that, he will need to pick up again in 10 years when he's more ready for them. But he got the sense of this legal history of this Ghanaian woman who's fighting for the right to be free and not a slave there in Ghana. And it's definitely for adults. And then also he and I read together The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom, which and that's the other thing too, is it's a really good book. That's the other thing too, is, I struggled a little bit. I loved The Hiding Place as a child. I grew up in a very religious household. I struggle. It's definitely coming from a Christian point of view. I struggle with that as an adult. It's not necessarily, something that I just embrace, but I feel like I can talk to my kid about those things, and I don't want to be afraid. This is the same thing as I was talking about with Asterix and Obelix. I'm not afraid to address it. Look at this racist image of this African here. Okay, here's this great book. Look at these amazing heroes who rescued Jews during the but there's these other elements too that we can discuss, that we're not just imbibing these messages. So just don't be afraid to read books that appear to be far ahead of their level, and don't be afraid to discuss anything, and don't think I have to 100% agree with everything in the book in order to present it to my child.
No, I agree. So, okay, let me see. We have some questions. Oh, it is 4:41. We've been talking. So let's see. Here's a question from someone. And are you okay going this long? Yeah. Okay. Is there a resource you love that simplifies the conversation around culture, race, and religion? Yikes. Is there a resource you love that simplifies the conversation around culture, race, and religion?
Oh, can you simplify that? I'm not sure you can simplify it.
I don't. Yeah.
And I don't know if you can just have that in like one book. Boy, that's a really good question. I don't have an immediate answer, but I will think about it, and maybe if I come up with something, we can add it in.
Okay, I'm gonna make a note of that.
but yeah, I am not at all convinced that you can simplify that conversation.
No, I don't think so. You can culture, race, and religion. I mean, that's loaded. I think my approach is to just constantly be talking about it and just constantly expose them to it. So, for example, I'm Catholic. I grew up Catholic. My grandparents are Muslim, or were, they passed away. My late grandparents were Muslim, but I grew up Catholic, was raised Catholic, like staunch Catholic, So, and we would, when we would go to Eid celebrations at my grandparents in the village, and I say it all the time, I would eat salamit on Friday and then go to church on Sunday and take communion. And it was nothing. It was just the way my family was, so, but that's something that I talk about to the kids now, just in general, and discussing about religion, the different religions that exist. One of my best friends is Muslim, so we just talk about it so freely and so openly. And we just talk about the fact that everyone believes in different things, there are different belief systems. So I think it's just always talking about and exploring. That's the thing too, that I love about historical fiction books. When you read historical fiction, a lot of times they get into the history of the religion, and so, for example, A Tudor Turk, which is one of the books that we read, it's in one of our past boxes, and that explored the relationship between the Persian Empire and Europe, when it wasn't this big Western ideology that we know it of now, and explore the Persian Empire, the relationship between the Persian Empire and Africa and the United Kingdom, and then also explored the history of the religions of the Persian people back then. So those kinds of books, that's the best way to get into the relationships between culture and religion, in my opinion. And that's why, I know I geek out on books quite a bit, but a lot of times I feel like as a parent, the author has done the work for us. They've done all the work. They've done all the research. They've packaged all that information in a manner that makes it accessible to the kids. They've provided the language. All we have to do literally is just pick it up and read it with them and talk about it with them. So that's my answer to that. And then
another thought, just to tack on to that, and I think conversation is key around all of these things, that you don't just throw books or other things at kids and then leave them to it. But I also think that it's really helpful. This is where global literature comes into it too. Like some of these conversations around race and religion and culture are really fraught in our society right now, very tense. And sometimes it can be very difficult to talk about these things. So I teach college level classes, and one of the things I've discovered is that it's easier for my students to talk about race and racism if I put it in a completely non-American context. So this is a huge value of global literature too. Is so, if you look at apartheid in South Africa, rather than segregation in the South, you're actually looking at the same exact concept. You're looking at historical trends that are exactly similar in so many ways, but you can talk about it without sometimes the tension. And so I think that sometimes it can be helpful. Maybe with your kids, you feel like it's not as tense, but when they could be teenagers and you might feel like you're on different sides of the political aisle in some ways, you may be less on different sides of the political aisle than you realize. And if you can take that conversation outside of the fraught, tense context in which it's, currently being understood and talked about in your home or in your community, and discuss it outside with things that maybe both of you are learning about, it can change the nature of that conversation.
Yeah.
So,
And it also boils down to knowing your child and knowing what their maturity level is, knowing, what your relationship is, what they can handle, because that way it's basically a strategy of having this conversation. How can I have this conversation in the most effective manner? And then when you've introduced global concepts, then you can still come back to the meat of the problem and focus on how things are actually presented in the United States, because especially if you're Black, that's your reality when you step outside the door. But if talking about it in a global context helps your child understand a little bit more and gives them something to grasp, then that's another advantage of introducing globally diverse children's books, or books in
and if
general,
you're a
actually.
teacher, it can be easier too,
Yeah,
because
that's
then you're
true.
not
Yeah,
worried necessarily about the conversation breaking down into
yeah, yeah,
chaos and
yeah,
potentially shouting.
yeah. That makes sense. Oh, okay. Another question. Woo, time flew. Let's see. Is there a community online in Goodreads or elsewhere where kids can share and review these books with one another?
Yeah, there is there's actually what is it called? There is I'm gonna see if I can look it up for you, but there's a
Okay.
place where kids can do reviews of
Okay.
books and write their
Okay.
reviews.
Yeah.
And
Well, I'll let you look. While you look, I'm going to talk.
okay,
So,
that's helpful.
yeah. Since we've talked quite a bit, and I know we got into a lot of things during this discussion, and a lot of like websites and resources. So don't fret. We will provide all of that in a summary of this conversation. But I wanted to talk to you about a few books that Catalyst Press published. Of course, I talked about Shaka Rising, and this was in our December box. So December 2020 box. So you can find that on our website. And this is the part 2, King Shaka, which is the sequel to that, which is really, really good. And then we have the Lolo series, Hooray for Lolo, and Here Comes Lolo, set in South Africa. And I just love it. Jessica already knows how much I love this book. And here's why. Books featuring kids being regular kids are my favorite. Like books, they don't have to be saving the world. They don't have to be surviving, like, I don't know, civil war, which is what you find quite a bit when you hear about children's books set in Africa. But this is a little South African girl just doing regular little girl stuff. And then this is The Thousand Steps by Helen Brain. We didn't feature this, so it's not in our boxes, but I read this already, and it's really good. It's the beginning of are the other parts of this series out?
The second one's coming out next summer.
Okay. So here is another one of my favorite types of books. Books futuristic of fantasy books set in a different part of the world. I joke all the time that kids in different parts of the world like to see themselves in futuristic novels too, and that's what I love about this. This is like a fantastic kind of fantasy futuristic set in a is it a post-apartheid future South Africa? Is that a right?
It's post-apartheid. It's post-apocalyptic.
Post-apocalyptic, yes.
Yeah.
And so that's a good one. So just wanted to show you some of the books that have come out of Catalyst Press lately. And you can check that out in our past boxes or where books are sold. So,
and I found the Kids Book Buzz. Kids Book Buzz. Kids write reviews. They're published online. It's a great resource. So,
perfect.
And if you're a homeschooler, there's outschool.com. Actually, you can do outschool.com whether you're a homeschooler or not, and they have things like weekly book clubs. And it's really inexpensive, usually, these types of classes. there usually is like a range of ages, so which I love personally, because I don't think age segregation is a very good way for kids to interact, but they'll be like, say, 9 to 12-year-olds or whatever.
Right.
And so they have things like these little book clubs, or a Harry Potter book club. So those are, so it might be around a specific series or whatever, or it could just be general, but outschool.com has some good things like that, these little ongoing clubs. Kidsbookbuzz.com, and then there was something else that is escaping me right now, but maybe we'll come back.
Well, yeah, we'll come back and we'll put everything in here. So, okay, we've definitely gone over time. If you've hung with us so far, thank you. You can tell book nerds when you see them. We get a little carried away. But no, this has been great. Hopefully you learned or got some valuable information out of this. Picture books are for everyone. Use books set in different parts of the world as a jumping off starting point for discussions with your child. And we'll provide all those resources. Book reports, again, books set in different parts of the world. That's easy. That's low-hanging fruit, for your child to select one of those types of books and use it for a book report. Gone are the days of Tales of Two Cities. It's a great book, but we don't have to stick with those traditional books anymore. So if you have any questions, drop them in the comments. We'll take a look and answer them later. Thank you so much, Jessica. This has been a thrill. Yeah, no, this is awesome. And I have learned quite a bit. I was taking like furious notes of it here. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll put all the information there. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.